In the heart of Louisiana, hidden behind layers of razor wire and concrete walls, stood Blackridge Correctional Facility, a place locals whispered about but never dared to ask too many questions. For decades, it had been known as a warehouse for the forgotten. Men society didn't want to see, men the system didn't want to deal with anywhere else. The place smelled of bleach, rust, and sweat, and yet even in a fortress built to strip people of every trace of humanity, one inmate somehow managed to shine. His name was Adrian Cole, 27 years old, serving a 10-year sentence for fraud and grand larceny. He wasn't the kind of criminal that usually earned a reputation inside. He wasn't a gang leader, he wasn't a killer, and he didn't carry scars of the streets carved into his face. Instead, Adrian had something far more dangerous inside those walls. Beauty. 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, with sharp cheekbones and eyes so piercing that even the most hardened inmates felt unsettled when he stared too long. His smile carried the same power as a knife, sharp, unpredictable, and deadly in its own way. From the moment he entered Blackridge, the gossip started. "That boy don't belong here," one guard muttered on intake day, watching Adrian walk through the gate like he was stepping onto a runway. In the cafeteria, other prisoners whispered about how the guards, especially the women, seemed a little too eager to process his paperwork, how they lingered at his cell just a second too long, how his charm rolled off him like heat from asphalt in July. Adrian noticed it too. He had always known his looks were his ticket in life. The reason women handed over credit cards, cars, even their trust. Prison, he discovered, wasn't any different. Blackridge had its own rhythm, and the women who worked there were part of it. Some were seasoned officers with years of experience, hardened by the constant pressure of keeping men in line. Others were younger, still learning how to balance discipline with compassion, still vulnerable to the attention they were never supposed to acknowledge. Each of them carried their own burdens, lonely marriages, financial struggles, or the kind of emptiness that made them linger when someone like Adrian looked at them a little too kindly. The first months passed quietly, but the silence was deceptive. Small cracks began to show in the daily routine. A longer than usual conversation at the end of a shift. A subtle smile exchanged across the yard. A guard standing a little too close when patting him down after work duty. Adrian didn't push. He didn't have to. They came to him. Inmates started calling him Hollywood. Guards started warning each other in hushed tones, "Don't get caught up in that one." But Blackridge was the kind of place where warnings rarely saved anyone. Everyone carried secrets through those gates, and secrets had a way of bleeding into the concrete. By the end of his first year, Adrian Cole was no longer just another inmate. He was the storm no one saw coming, the kind that bruised quietly on the horizon, pulling the sky darker with every passing day. What no one could predict was just how far his reach would go, or how many lives it would entangle before it was over. It started as nothing more than whispers in the cell blocks, the kind of talk that usually faded into the background noise of prison life. "Hollywood's at it again," someone would mutter during chow. "You see how Officer Daniel smiled at him yesterday?" Another would add, half joking, half serious. In a place where men were stripped of power, stripped of freedom, even rumors carried weight. And Adrian Cole was at the center of every one of them. The thing about Blackridge was that gossip spread faster than contraband. It started with the inmates noticing the small details. A guard pausing too long at Adrian's door, a folded note slipped under his tray, a phone call that somehow made it through when others couldn't. To the men locked inside, those signs were louder than sirens. They watched closely because in prison, watching was survival. And what they saw confirmed what they already believed. Adrian Cole had found a way to bend the system, not with violence or intimidation, but with the same weapon he had used on the outside, desire. By the second year of his sentence, the whispers had turned into full-blown speculation. "He's got at least 3 of them wrapped around his finger," one inmate said, smirking through the bars. Another swore he'd seen Adrian and a guard disappear into the janitor's closet for 20 minutes during night shift. No one ever had proof, but in a place like Blackridge, proof didn't matter. The story itself was enough to create tension. Even the male guards couldn't ignore it. Some laughed it off, calling him pretty boy under their breath, but behind the laughter was resentment. To them, Adrian wasn't just another inmate. He was a threat to order. If a man could charm his way past the rules, what did that say about the authority they carried on their belts and in their guns? The resentment simmered, quiet but sharp, and Adrian could feel it every time he walked past them. He knew the eyes on his back weren't just watching, they were waiting. For the women, it was different. Blackridge was suffocating. The endless grind of 12-hour shifts, the constant weight of distrust between guard and prisoner, it wore them down. So when someone like Adrian looked at them with kindness, even if it was manufactured, it felt like oxygen. He knew how to read them, how to compliment without being obvious, how to make them feel seen in a place designed to erase humanity. And slowly, inevitably, the lines blurred. There was Officer Jenkins, who had just gone through a messy divorce and was raising 2 kids alone. She started leaving extra portions on Adrian's tray, by mistake. Then there was Officer Merez, young and eager to prove herself, who found herself laughing at his jokes even when she knew she shouldn't. And Officer Daniels, the one the inmates talked about the most, who seemed to linger in the control booth whenever Adrian was on yard duty, her eyes following him in a way that didn't look professional. Each of them told themselves it was harmless. A smile, a conversation, maybe a small favor. But in Blackridge, nothing stayed harmless for long. The walls had eyes, and the rumors kept growing. By the time Adrian hit his 3rd year, the whispers had taken on a life of their own. Some inmates claimed he had a list of guards who would sneak him anything he wanted. Others swore he was keeping diaries filled with details of his encounters, insurance in case anyone tried to turn on him. None of it was confirmed, but the effect was undeniable. The entire prison seemed to orbit around him, like a gravitational pull no one could escape. The administration tried to clamp down, transferring guards, tightening schedules, running surprise searches. But Adrian always seemed untouched, almost untouchable. Every new restriction only made the rumors louder. They can't stop him, inmates whispered in the showers. He's too good at the game. And deep down, even the men who hated him had to admit, it wasn't just luck. Adrian Cole was different. He wasn't the strongest, he wasn't the most violent, but he understood people. He understood weakness. And he was patient. In a place where time was all anyone had, patience was the most powerful weapon of all. What no one realized was that the whispers were only the beginning. The storm hadn't arrived yet. It was still gathering, swelling in the shadows of Blackridge, waiting for the right moment to break. And when it did, it would shake the prison and everyone inside it to the core. It began with one guard, then another, and soon it became impossible to ignore. At first, the news trickled through the grapevine like any other piece of prison gossip. Half believed, quickly dismissed, the kind of rumor that burns bright for a week before fading away. But this one didn't fade. It grew. By the spring of 2018, 9 female correctional officers at Blackridge Correctional Facility, 9 women who worked inside those same walls, were pregnant. And every single one of them pointed to the same man, Adrian Cole. The revelation hit the prison like a grenade. Guards whispered about it during shift changes. Inmates laughed and jeered from behind their bars, and administrators scrambled to keep the truth from leaking to the press. But Blackridge was a pressure cooker, and once a story like that slipped out, there was no way to contain it. Hollywood did it. The inmates declared with pride, as though Adrian's conquest was a victory for all of them against a system designed to strip them of masculinity, freedom, and power. For the women, though, it was far more complicated. Officer Jenkins, the single mother already drowning in bills, said Adrian had made her feel wanted again, like she wasn't just a body in a uniform. Officer Ramirez claimed it wasn't even about love, just loneliness and a moment of weakness that spiraled into something she couldn't take back. Officer Daniels avoided every question, her face pale as her co-workers looked at her with a mixture of pity and disgust. And then there were the others, older women, younger women, women who should have known better, yet found themselves drawn into the same orbit. Each had a story, a justification, a reason why they crossed the line. DNA tests left no room for denial. The results were cold, clinical, undeniable. All 9 pregnancies led back to one man, Adrian Cole. The media caught wind almost immediately. Headlines screamed across the country. Inmate fathers 9 babies with prison guards. Hollywood in chains. The seductive power of Adrian Cole. America's most handsome convict exposed. Blackridge became a circus. News vans parked outside the gates. Reporters hounded officials, and social media exploded with commentary. Some people were horrified, pointing to corruption, abuse of power, and the collapse of the system. Others were enthralled, treating Adrian like a celebrity, a folk hero who had managed to bend prison to his will. Women online left comments under his mugshot. "He can lock me up anytime." No wonder they couldn't resist. Inside the prison, chaos brewed. Male guards seethed with anger, humiliated that one inmate had made a mockery of their authority. He turned this place into a joke. One officer spat, slamming his locker. The resentment was so thick it hung in the air. Every shift, every meal line, every routine search carried the potential to erupt into violence. Inmates felt emboldened, embers of rebellion flaring just from the knowledge that one of their own had seduced the very people meant to control them. The administration tried to paint the scandal as the result of a few bad apples. They suspended the women involved, reassigned others, and issued press releases filled with words like isolated incidents and breach of conduct. But no one bought it. Not when 9 officers, nearly a quarter of the women working in Blackridge, were carrying the same man's child. As for Adrian, he didn't deny it. He didn't confirm it either. When investigators asked him, he leaned back in his chair, lips curling into the kind of smile that had already ruined careers, and said only, "You already know the answer." To some, that silence was smugness. To others, it was proof of his legend. Behind the spectacle, though, were real lives unraveling. Families broke apart as husbands and boyfriends learned the truth. Children watched their mothers led out of the prison in handcuffs, charged with misconduct, conspiracy, or simply dismissed in disgrace. The women who were pregnant faced impossible choices: abortions, resignations, or the terrifying decision to bring their child into a world already drenched in scandal. For Adrian, the fallout was a double-edged sword. On one hand, he had become larger than life, a living myth within those walls, feared and adored in equal measure. On the other, the attention painted a target squarely on his back. The guards who hated him now had motive. The administrators who wanted the scandal buried had reason to silence him. Even some of the women who once loved him began to wonder if they had been nothing more than pawns in a game he had perfected long before prison bars locked behind him. The prison's corridors buzzed with tension, every conversation laced with suspicion. "How long you think he's got before somebody takes him out?" one inmate asked. Another smirked. "Doesn't matter. He already won." But Adrian didn't look like a man who'd won. He was restless, pacing his cell at night, staring out the bars with a gnawing unease he couldn't quite explain. Maybe he had finally gone too far. Maybe he knew the storm was coming. And in a place like Blackridge, storms didn't pass, they destroyed. By the summer, Adrian Cole was no longer just another inmate locked away in Blackridge. He was a phenomenon. His story had leaked beyond the prison walls, taking on a life of its own. Tabloids plastered his face on their covers, calling him the most dangerous lover in America. Talk shows debated whether he was a predator exploiting vulnerable women or a genius who had exposed the rot of the correctional system. Hashtags trended online. Hashtag Hollywood in chains. Hashtag Adrian Cole. Even people who had never heard of Blackridge suddenly knew it as the prison where one man had impregnated 9 guards. For inmates, Adrian became something like a legend. In a place where men felt stripped of dignity and control, he was proof that it was still possible to bend the system, to flip the balance of power. "That man's a king," one inmate said in the yard, nodding toward Adrian as if he were royalty among thieves. But outside those gates, the picture was more complicated. Women wrote him letters, some promising loyalty, others begging to carry his child too. He received fan mail every week, perfumed envelopes stuffed with photos, cash, even marriage proposals. One woman scrawled across a letter, "You don't belong in a cell, you belong in my bed." To his admirers, Adrian was no criminal. He was an icon, the embodiment of dangerous desire. Still, not everyone was seduced. On the nightly news, stern-faced commentators condemned the scandal as a national disgrace. "This isn't about romance," one anchor said flatly. "This is about corruption, about women sworn to uphold the law betraying their oaths, about a system so broken it allowed one man to humiliate it on a global stage." Politicians demanded answers, promising investigations and reforms, while law enforcement unions fumed, insisting Adrian had weaponized his looks and manipulated women who should have known better. Inside Blackridge, the tension was unbearable. Every step Adrian took was shadowed by stares, some filled with awe, others with hate. Male guards clenched their fists whenever he walked past, convinced he had made them look weak. The women who weren't involved whispered his name with a mix of disgust and curiosity, as if afraid they might fall into the same trap. The 9 who were pregnant had either been reassigned or dismissed, but their absence was louder than their presence had ever been. Adrian lingered like a ghost in every conversation, every shift. And yet, through it all, he carried himself with the same quiet confidence that had brought him this far. He didn't brag. He didn't gloat. When asked about the media frenzy, he would smirk, lean back against the cinder-block wall of his cell, and mutter, "They'll talk until they get tired." But behind that calm exterior was a man who understood his position better than anyone. He knew he was walking a razor's edge, idolized by some, despised by others, and watched by everyone. The warden tried to bury the storm. Adrian was moved to a more restricted wing, his visits cut, his mail censored, his privileges stripped down to nothing. But it didn't matter. His name had already left the prison. The public couldn't stop talking about him, and the institution couldn't erase what he had done. Every restriction only added to his mystique, painting him as the man the system feared. The irony was impossible to ignore. Blackridge was built to crush men, to erase them, to ensure their names never left the yard. But Adrian Cole had flipped the script. His story wasn't one of erasure, but of notoriety. He wasn't fading into anonymity. He was growing into a symbol, whether people liked it or not. Yet symbols are dangerous. They inspire, but they also provoke. And for every person who saw Adrian as a rebel hero, there was someone else who wanted him silenced. Deep down, Adrian must have known it couldn't last. That legends burn bright, but never for long. In a place like Blackridge, the higher you rise, the closer you get to the fall. The myth of Adrian Cole was larger than the man himself, and like all myths, it eventually began to crack. What had once been playful whispers and secret thrills turned into sharp-edged resentment, jealousy, and fear. Inside Blackridge, the air grew heavier by the day. Men who had once cheered him on now watched him with narrowed eyes, muttering in corners about how one inmate had managed to upend the balance of the prison. Guards who had once smirked at the gossip now clenched their jaws, furious that his story had made them the butt of jokes across the country. And the women, the ones carrying his children, were no longer untouchable. They had become cautionary tales, ridiculed and discarded by the very system they once served. Some of the women turned bitter. Officer Ramirez, the youngest of the 9, admitted to a friend that she felt used. "He told me I was different," she whispered, "but he said the same thing to all of us." She had once laughed at Adrian's jokes, flushed when he touched her hand, convinced she mattered more than the others. Now she saw herself as just another pawn in his game. The realization ate away at her, and she wasn't alone. Several of the women began resenting each other, blaming one another for the scandal, for their ruined careers, their broken families. What had started as affection twisted into rivalry, and rivalry into hatred. The male guards, meanwhile, grew restless. Every headline that mentioned Adrian's name felt like a stain on their uniforms. "He made fools out of us," one officer barked in the locker room, slamming his fist against the metal door. Another spat back, "No, he made fools out of the women. And now we're the ones paying for it." Their anger was complicated, wrapped in pride and humiliation, but it needed somewhere to land. More and more, it landed on Adrian. They searched his cell longer, shoved him harder during pat-downs, barked his name with venom dripping from every syllable. It was only a matter of time before resentment became something darker. Even among the inmates, cracks spread. For a while, Adrian had been untouchable. But heroes don't share power, and in prison, power is always contested. Some of the older gang leaders began to see him less as a symbol of rebellion and more as a liability. He's bringing heat down on all of us. One lifer muttered in the yard. Feds sniffing around, cameras everywhere. All because Pretty Boy can't keep his pants up. Envy brewed, and envy in prison was poison. Adrian himself felt the shift. He could sense the way conversations stopped when he walked into a room, how laughter cut off like a blade slicing through air. His confidence hadn't disappeared, but it had become edged with unease. He knew the game he was playing, and he knew the cost. Legends inspire worship, yes, but they also invite knives in the dark. The warden, under pressure from state officials, doubled down on restrictions. Adrian was isolated more often, his interactions monitored, his mail filtered until barely a scrap got through. But the tighter the system tried to control him, the more dangerous the atmosphere became. It was as if Blackridge itself was turning against him, walls closing in, faces sharpening with malice. The women outside the prison, the ones who had once sent fan mail and promises of loyalty, grew divided as well. Some still wrote to him, fantasizing about the outlaw lover who had conquered 9 women behind bars. Others turned, disgusted, calling him a manipulator, a predator who had ruined lives without blinking. The media fed the frenzy, running stories of the officers' ruined families, children now born into scandal, and whispered that lawsuits were coming. Every word printed, every headline broadcast, pushed Adrian further into the role of villain rather than hero. And then there were the rumors that someone inside had been ordered to handle him. Whispers spread that the administration wanted the problem erased quietly. Others believed rival inmates had marked him for humiliation or worse. Still others claimed one of the pregnant women, consumed by jealousy or betrayal, had sworn revenge. Adrian's name no longer carried the aura of untouchable charm. It carried a death sentence waiting to be delivered. Nights in Blackridge grew colder for him. He lay awake in his cell, staring at the ceiling, listening for footsteps that lingered too long outside his door. His smile remained for the public, for the cameras, for the guards who tried to rattle him. But in private, his eyes betrayed something he had never shown before: fear. Because in prisons like Blackridge, storms don't blow over. They build until the walls crack. And for Adrian Cole, the storm wasn't coming. It was already here. It was a cold November morning when the call came over the radio: inmate down, cell block D, East Wing restroom. At first, nobody moved with urgency. False alarms were common, and more often than not, inmate down meant a fight, a faint, or a stage collapse meant to get a trip to the infirmary. But when the second call came, the tone of the officer's voice was different, strained, frantic, as if even saying the words out loud was hard to believe. It's Cole. It's Adrian Cole. He's not breathing. By the time backup arrived, the scene was grim. Adrian was slumped on the cracked tile floor of the restroom, his head half submerged in a toilet bowl stained with rust and bleach. His wrists bore faint red lines, as if someone had held him down hard, and his neck was marked with dark bruises, the telltale pattern of strangulation. His lips were bluish, his eyes glassy, frozen open in an expression that seemed both shocked and resigned. One officer retched in the corner, unable to stomach the sight. Another whispered, almost to herself, "God damn, they finally got him." The prison went into immediate lockdown. Sirens blared, metal doors slammed shut, and inmates were shoved back into their cells. Guards scrambled through the halls, their boots echoing like thunder, while administrators rushed to the scene, barking orders no one seemed to follow. For the men in their cells, the news spread like fire. "Hollywood's dead," someone hissed through the bars. "They killed him in the shitter." Within minutes, the whole facility buzzed with the same electric current of disbelief and inevitability. The initial report filed by the guards claimed Adrian had been found alone, that it looked like a possible suicide. But anyone who saw the body knew better. There was nothing neat or quiet about the way Adrian had died. His face bore the panic of a man who had fought, even if his last fight was brief and hopeless. And those bruises, those weren't self-inflicted. Speculation erupted immediately. Some whispered that it was the male guards, finally exacting revenge for the humiliation he had brought them. Others said it was orchestrated from the top, that the warden had ordered someone to make Adrian disappear to stop the scandal from spiraling any further. A few inmates believed it was payback from one of the women, jealous, betrayed, furious at the realization that she hadn't been the only one. The coroner's report complicated things further. While strangulation marks were clear, there were also traces of an unknown substance in Adrian's system. Something forced down his throat, a chemical not usually found in the prison. Theories doubled overnight. Poison to weaken him before the killing blow, or perhaps an attempt to stage an overdose gone wrong. The truth seemed buried under layers of deception, each more suspicious than the last. The warden faced the cameras that afternoon, voice flat and eyes bloodshot, insisting it was an ongoing investigation and offering no further comment. But outside the gates, the press exploded. Headlines screamed, "Hollywood dead in prison restroom." News anchors debated every angle, spinning theories, dissecting his final moments as if they were experts. To some, his death was karmic justice, the natural end of a manipulator who had exploited women and mocked the system. To others, it was a cover-up, proof that the state had executed him in secret, silencing a man who had become too powerful. Inside the walls, fear rippled. Inmates stared at the closed-off restroom, the yellow tape stretched across the doorway, and wondered who might be next. Guards kept their eyes low, whispering only when sure no one else was listening. Everyone knew Adrian's death was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of something darker. The women who carried his children were shattered. Some sobbed in private, clutching their swelling stomachs, insisting he had loved them. Others fell into silence, refusing to speak about him at all. Officer Ramirez was said to have collapsed when she heard the news, whispering through tears, "He promised me." Over time, their grief twisted into paranoia. If Adrian could be erased so brutally, what would stop the system from erasing them too? Among the men, however, a strange kind of reverence took hold. Inmates began to treat Adrian's death like martyrdom. They scratched his initials into walls, whispered his name like a prayer, and traded embellished versions of how he died. In their retellings, Adrian hadn't been a victim, but a warrior who went down fighting, dragged into the toilet by men too afraid to face him straight. The truth didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the legend. The official cause of death, listed weeks later, was asphyxiation due to unknown causes. The phrasing did little to calm suspicions. Unknown causes was prison code for something they couldn't or wouldn't explain. No one was ever charged. No one ever confessed, and the case was quietly closed, buried under bureaucracy. But the silence only made the myth grow louder. Months later, when the bathroom was reopened, inmates claimed they could still hear the sound of choking in the pipes, that the toilets gurgled louder at night, as if replaying Adrian's final moments. Guards dismissed it as nonsense, but even they avoided that restroom after dark. It had become sacred ground, a shrine not of worship, but of warning. And so, the man who had once ruled Blackridge without a weapon, who had seduced 9 women and embarrassed an entire system, was reduced to a body in a prison restroom. But in death, Adrian Cole had achieved what he never could in life: immortality. He was no longer just Hollywood, no longer just a con man or an inmate. He was a ghost, a legend, a story whispered through iron bars and passed down in shadows. In Blackridge, legends never died. They haunted, and Adrian Cole's ghost was just getting started. The morning after Adrian Cole's death, Blackridge Correctional Facility became less a prison and more a crime scene. Yellow tape still hung over the restroom door, the tiles scrubbed until they gleamed with the smell of bleach, but everyone knew the truth, that no amount of bleach could erase the stain of what had happened. Local authorities were called in first. But the scandal had grown too large, too fast. Within days, the FBI was on the ground, federal suits striding past correctional officers with clipboards and cameras, treating every guard like a suspect. The interviews began immediately. Correctional staff were called one by one into cramped offices, sitting under buzzing fluorescent lights, while agents asked the same questions in different ways. Where were you that morning? What did you hear? Did you ever see anyone threaten Adrian Cole? Some guards bristled at the questioning, arms crossed, voices sharp. Others broke down, nervously fumbling through alibis that only made them look guiltier. The male guards, many of whom had long despised Adrian, fell under the heaviest suspicion. Their resentment was well documented, their words recorded in disciplinary reports, comments about teaching Hollywood a lesson or shutting him up for good. But suspicion didn't stop there. The pregnant officers, the 9 women whose names had already been dragged through every news broadcast in the country, were interrogated with equal intensity. Each woman denied involvement, though their stories cracked at the edges. Officer Ramirez admitted she had visited Adrian's cell days before his death, insisting it was just a talk. Privately, Ramirez confessed to investigators that Adrian had begged her for protection. He told her he felt marked, that men were plotting against him. She admitted she walked away, too afraid of losing her job again, and in tears told the FBI, if I'd stayed that night, maybe he'd still be alive. Officer Daniels, pale and trembling, said she had received a note from him that week, but claimed she burned it immediately. One woman broke down in tears, crying, he told me he was scared, that someone was going to hurt him. The FBI found more questions than answers. Security cameras near the restroom had conveniently gone offline for maintenance the night before. Logbooks had gaps, entire hours missing from the duty roster. One agent later admitted under oath that a backup hard drive with the footage did exist, showing 2 shadows entering the restroom minutes before Adrian's death. But that hard drive was mysteriously lost in transit to Washington. Officially, it was chalked up as an accident. Unofficially, it was the closest thing to proof that someone wanted Adrian gone. And though every guard swore they hadn't entered the East Wing at the time of Adrian's death, swipe card records told a different story. Someone had been there. More than one person, in fact. As weeks dragged on, the investigation reached beyond the prison. Reporters uncovered years of corruption at Blackridge, guards smuggling in contraband, sexual misconduct ignored by superiors, disciplinary files that vanished into thin air. Adrian's death became the centerpiece of a much larger picture, a system rotting from the inside. Congressmen demanded hearings. Civil rights groups demanded justice, calling the prison a slaughterhouse of secrets. For once, the suffering of inmates was front-page news, and Adrian Cole's face, smirking in that infamous mugshot, was everywhere. Meanwhile, conspiracy theories spread like wildfire. Some swore the warden had ordered the hit, desperate to silence the scandal before his own career imploded. Others believed it was the male guards, acting together in a brotherhood pact to restore their pride. Still others whispered darker theories, that one of the women, broken by betrayal and humiliation, had lured him to the restroom herself. The coroner's toxicology report only deepened the mystery. The substance found in Adrian's system was identified as a cocktail of sedatives and cleaning agents, not something he could have acquired on his own. Someone had access. Someone had planned this. The word homicide was carefully avoided in the official statements, replaced with vague phrases like suspicious circumstances and foul play under review. But everyone knew. Suicide was a convenient story, and no one bought it. Families of the 9 women were dragged into the chaos. Husbands filed for divorce. Children were bullied at school, and several women went into hiding to escape the cameras camped on their front lawns. One of them gave a tearful interview on national television, insisting he wasn't a monster. He made me feel alive when I was dead inside. But instead of sympathy, the segment only fueled more outrage. Commentators mocked her. Protesters gathered outside Blackridge with signs reading, "No more cover UPS," and "Justice for Adrian." In the prison yard, Adrian's death became a myth. Inmates etched his name into the concrete benches, passed around scraps of paper with his initials, told stories of his final moments as if they'd been there. They jumped him, one inmate swore. 4 guards all at once. He fought till the end. Another insisted. It was the feds. They needed him gone before he could talk. Months passed, and still no charges were filed. The FBI released a statement acknowledging irregularities in Blackridge operations, but declined to name suspects. The state launched its own task force, promising reforms. Politicians stood behind podiums. Shaking their fists, vowing to clean up the mess. But behind closed doors, files were buried, careers quietly reshaped, and the truth about Adrian's death slipped further out of reach. For the public, the case became a dividing line. Some argued that Adrian had gotten what he deserved, a manipulator finally outsmarted by the very game he played. Others saw him as a victim, a man punished not for his crimes, but for embarrassing the powerful. The debates were endless, the headlines relentless, but the truth remained the same. No one would ever officially be held accountable for what happened in that restroom. And yet, justice took its own form. Several of the guards suspected of involvement resigned under pressure, their careers in ruins. The warden retired early, disappearing into quiet obscurity. Lawsuits piled up, costing the state millions in settlements. And those 9 children, born from scandal, grew into living reminders of a story the government wished everyone would forget. Adrian Cole was gone, but his ghost lingered in every courtroom, every protest sign, every whispered conversation about corruption and power. His death hadn't ended the scandal. It had immortalized it. Blackridge Correctional Facility would never be the same again, and neither would the people who lived in its shadow. In the end, the story of Adrian Cole refused to die. Blackridge Correctional Facility tried to return to business as usual, but the walls themselves seemed to hum with the memory of him. Guards avoided the East Wing restroom even after it was scrubbed clean and reopened, whispering that his ghost lingered there. Inmates swapped stories about him late at night, their voices low, as though saying his name too loudly might bring trouble. He had gone into that bathroom as a man despised and adored in equal measure. But in death, he became something else entirely, an untouchable myth stitched into the lore of Blackridge forever. Outside those walls, the legacy was Messier. 9 women carried children linked forever to Adrian's bloodline. Their lives were shattered in ways they could never repair. Some left the state entirely, raising their babies in anonymity, hoping to outrun the whispers that followed them. Others embraced the notoriety, selling interviews, writing memoirs, or appearing on daytime talk shows where audiences couldn't decide whether to pity them or condemn them. Each child grew up under a shadow, branded before they could even speak. To some, they were symbols of corruption. To others, proof that Adrian's power lived on. The prison system itself took a hit it would never fully recover from. Investigations and lawsuits bled into one another, exposing years of misconduct not just at Blackridge but across the state. Laws were passed tightening oversight, mandating stricter training, and limiting contact between inmates and staff. Politicians held up the scandal as a reason to call for reform, though behind closed doors many admitted what everyone already knew. Adrian Cole was not the disease, he was the symptom. He had exposed the cracks in a system designed to fail, and his story became a rallying cry for activists demanding change. For the public, the fascination never faded. Documentaries painted him alternately as a master manipulator and a tragic antihero. Podcasts dissected every detail, from his childhood to the bruises on his neck, while internet forums built conspiracy theories claiming the government had orchestrated his murder. True crime enthusiasts called him the Inmate Casanova, while critics called him a predator who had exploited weakness wherever he found it. America couldn't agree on who he was, but it couldn't look away either. Even within the FBI, his case lingered as an open wound. Files marked with his name sat in drawers, thick with interviews, lab reports, and unanswered questions. Agents who had worked the investigation privately admitted they never believed the official story. Too many gaps, too many coincidences. The truth of who killed Adrian Cole, and why, was buried as surely as he had been, left to rot under bureaucratic silence. But the inmates of Blackridge, the men who had watched him rise and fall, didn't need official reports to tell them the truth. To them, Adrian had been proof that even in the belly of the beast, one man could bend the rules. He had seduced 9 women sworn to keep him caged, embarrassed the guards who held the keys, and forced the world to notice him. In their eyes, his death only confirmed what they already knew. No system could allow a man like that to live. Years later, when his children grew old enough to ask about their father, each heard a different version of his story. Some were told he was a legend, a man too powerful for the world to contain. Others were told he was a criminal who ruined lives and paid the price. But no matter how the story was spun, one truth remained. His name still sparked argument, still stirred emotions, still carried weight long after his body had gone cold. Blackridge itself fell into decline. Administrators rotated in and out, lawsuits drained its budget, and scandals continued to ripple through its corridors. Locals swore the place was cursed, doomed the moment Adrian Cole set foot inside. By the time the prison was finally shuttered a decade later, its legacy was sealed. The closing report cited structural and financial strain, but everyone knew what had really broken it. It wasn't concrete or steel. It was one man and the chaos he left behind. In the final accounting, Adrian Cole left behind no wealth, no property, no possessions of value. What he left was far more dangerous, a legend. To some, he was a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked desire, proof that charisma could corrupt and destroy. To others, he was a martyr, silenced by a system that feared what he represented. And for those who had lived it, for the guards, the inmates, the families, he was a wound that never fully healed. Because in the end, Adrian's true legacy wasn't the scandal or the headlines or even the children who bore his DNA. His true legacy was the question he left behind, a question that haunted every courtroom, every cell block, every living room where his story was told. Was Adrian Cole a monster who got what he deserved, or was he a man destroyed for daring to expose the truth? The answer depends on who you ask. But one thing is certain. Long after his body was buried, the name Adrian Cole still refused to rest. And in America, where true crime becomes folklore and folklore becomes legend, that was the kind of immortality no prison walls could ever contain.